the world we live in becomes increasingly defined by accelerated change and transformation, more and more people are rising up with ideas, projects and businesses that are fostering greater clarity, balance and consciousness. My name's Christian Burne and welcome to Agents of Calm. A series of interviews and discussions that aim to capture the stories, ideas and wisdom of these vital change makers and spread a little bit of calm along the way. Welcome to episode 4, where I had the enviable opportunity to speak with empathy expert and author Mimi Nicklin. Together, Mimi and I get deep into the subject of self-empathy with a gentle skew towards its value to new and early stage business owners. Over the next 45 minutes, we get clear on exactly what self-empathy is, how you can start practicing self-empathy, the benefits behind self-empathy, and both the data and science to back them up, and much, much more. It's a wonderful conversation. I hope you enjoy. So, hello Mimi, thank you very much indeed for joining me. I'm sorry it's taken us ages to get together, hasn't it?
It has, but you're so welcome. I'm so excited to be here and to be having this conversation.
Absolutely. Now, clearly you're one of the busiest people on the planet right now, but it would be good just to give us a chat, how you're doing, how the journey's going, you know, what's currently hot for you at the moment, what's next, just sort of give us an idea of where you're at.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm definitely not the busiest person on the planet, but it is a very exciting time. So my first book, Softening the Edge, comes out in about 6 weeks now, which is a crazy experience because suddenly after all that time of writing and editing and pondering, it's going to be in stores, so I'm busy doing that. I'm also just about to launch season 2 of Empathy for Breakfast, which is my breakfast show all about empathy, so that's very exciting. And yeah, rolling out the podcast, so trying to get sort of 2 to 3 episodes of that out a month and really drive the conversation around empathy up all around the world. So definitely not the busiest person, but certainly doing lots of great stuff.
Probably up there. So yeah, didn't I read that your Empathy for Breakfast has hit around 65,000 listeners now, like all over the world? Yeah, it's phenomenal.
That was season 1, and I started that as COVID started. You know, I started that in lockdown. It was I thought I would do it around about this time, actually, of August 2020, but brought it forward. And I think now the time when people are really open to this conversation about empathy and what we're doing in the world. So yeah, thanks. I was overwhelmed, actually.
Excellent. It's a great format. So just to restate the purpose of this chat. Usually I like to keep Agents of Calm conversations quite open, but given that I've got essentially like an expert on the subject I want to talk about today, there's a bit of structure around it. So I'm obviously really interested in the role of self-empathy as a tool for people who are either thinking about transitioning or in the early stages of transitioning into their own business, particularly as it relates to repairing and building self-esteem, but also the proactive resilience that they're going to need to be successful on that journey. So I thought today we'd delve a little bit deeper into that with yourself, if that's okay, and perhaps offer people listening some guidance and advice on, you know, how and why they should be prioritizing self-empathy, not just perhaps as a business owner, but as a human being as well. I think it's a wider conversation. So perhaps as a kickoff then, through the lens of somebody that has researched and written and at your level of expertise in this, what is self-empathy to you by definition? And if it is different to what we understand as traditional empathy, how is it different?
It's not really. I mean, empathy is empathy. So empathy at its core is about taking perspective. It's about understanding. It's about seeing the world generally, when you talk about empathy, through the eyes of another or the shoes of another, right? So it's about taking on the perspective of another. When we talk about self-empathy, we're fundamentally doing that to ourselves. So it's about understanding yourself. It's about looking at the perspective that you have and how you feel about that, and doing that without judgment, which is the key bit of all empathy, which I talk about all the time, right? Which is judgmentless understanding. It's about taking on board sort of how you're feeling, and how you see the world and understanding that. And I tend to break it into 3 parts when it comes to self-empathy. The first one is around curiosity. Curiosity drives understanding, whether that's about yourself or about others. But being curious, why do I feel this way? Why am I nervous about this? Why am I excited about this? Whatever the emotion is, however you're feeling, being curious about sort of digging into that a little bit more is probably the first part of self-empathy. The second part is around kindness, right? Is around just gentleness to yourself and not being overly or harshly critical or self-critical, especially if you're starting a new business or a new venture. We can do that, you know, to the nth degree, constantly criticizing what we're doing and should have done that and all those things. So self-empathy is about kindness to oneself, or just as I said, avoiding that overly harsh criticism. And the third piece is slightly sort of bigger contextually, which is around framing imperfection as a shared human reality. Very rarely do we make mistakes entirely alone. You know, very rarely, if there's a mistake or a failure or something we'd rather hadn't happened or we'd done slightly differently, very rare that A, we did it entirely alone, or B, we're the only person that's ever done it, right? So that is something that we share as humans. And so that's the third part, which is that framing of those feelings or imperfections or whatever they are as an experience and not just our own experience.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think particularly that last point about our relationship with failure, I think that's one of the top 5 self-esteem issues, is that we learn very young that mistakes and failures are bad and we'll get punished for them. And that's something that sort of gets ingrained in us from a young age. And if we don't purposefully shift that belief and shift our relationship with failure, it's very difficult to sort of grow in the way we need to grow. But going back to the first one about curiosity, for somebody that is completely new to this, and the whole idea of am I right in saying that self-empathy and self-compassion are the same thing? Could you put them into the same box?
Look, yes, you can. There's a lot of questions around, again, slightly bigger before we go back to the self, around the difference between empathy and sympathy or compassion. Of course, they're on a spectrum. So there are lots of areas of similarity. Compassion, which is part of sympathy, is about pity. So there's nothing wrong with that emotion at all. Like, it's a good emotion. Feel compassion or sympathy to someone, those are good emotions. But they are, when it comes to the self, from my point of view, it does begin to have judgment in it. It's about pity, right? So generally, when you're compassionate, it's because you feel a little bit sad for someone or sorry for someone. And for me, that's not something we really need to hero in ourselves as often as we probably do naturally. Whereas self-empathy is a little bit closer to, well, a lot closer to perspective. Right. So it's more judgmentless. It's about understanding oneself, understanding our reality and how we're feeling, and using that as a data set, as an aid, as a motivator, rather than perhaps moving into something which feels a little bit more like I'm feeling sorry for myself, which can easily happen. So, as I said, they're on a spectrum, but slightly different.
Right. So sorry, I jumped into a different question there on the first one. So going back to the curiosity. So if someone is new to self-empathy as a tool, or as something that they can do, how would they go about perhaps starting to exercise that a little bit?
Around curiosity? Yeah. Look, I think there's lots of areas. I mean, at its core, all empathy is about listening. So in this case, you're talking about listening to oneself. And I think one of the things that I've learned personally, but also through my work during COVID in the last 5 months, is that time and quietness allow us to empathize with ourselves more. Because when you are on the run all the time, and I do speak from personal experience, as I'm sure do you, it's very hard to take any form of perspective. It's very hard to take perspective about whether you like the new building that, you know, just got put up on your street, let alone about how you're feeling about things. So if you're trying to be more curious about yourself, you do need to give yourself some space and time to do so. There'll be various ways you can do that. Lots of people talk about mindfulness in the same breath as self-empathy because you're mindful of yourself, and whether that's full sort of meditation or yoga or something like that, or it's just about carving out time in your day, perhaps every morning, where you take a moment to, think about how you're feeling today, what you're willing to push yourself to today, what you want to achieve today. But a lot of it comes back to time, because to listen to ourselves, you do need that. And the other is around questions and questioning yourself, because curiosity is driven by inquiry, right? So, when you're feeling, I don't know, perhaps overwhelmed or stressed or, I don't know, exhausted or whatever you're feeling, or it could be a positive emotion, really happy or elated, questioning, why do I feel like that? What made me feel like that? How might I avoid or increase that, depending on the emotion in the future? So listening to how you feel, and then questioning why and how and when and what it is that provoked that. Types of areas that are quite useful. And as I said, that's framed in having time to do so, because you can't do that in the middle of boarding people.
Yeah. If I may, there's two things that come out from that spring to mind. I think the first one is an exercise that I do with clients when we're doing the alignment stage of the program that I put them through, and that's really looking at internally what needs to be shifted and moved, which is more intervention-based work, but also externally looking at their life and how it's set up. And often when you say, let me see your typical schedule for the week and show me what's missing. And initially it's like, well, nothing, it's all structured. Because typically you're talking about people that are relatively senior. So from an organizational point of view, they've got that nailed down. But when it comes to like what's missing, well, nothing's missing. Well, where's the time for you? Where's that reflection time? And I think the second one that comes up there that you were talking about is the time for kind of like what you do with that time. So scheduling the time that you have in, then also how you use that time. And I think a lot of it is when I love that saying, isn't it? The best time to teach a dog not to bark is when it's barking. But at the same time for us, the best time to teach ourselves, when you talked about stuff like overwhelm and stress, is when we're in that particular state, and just letting that be okay and giving yourself permission to feel like that, but then following that up with, that curiosity mindset to saying, it's okay, I'm overwhelmed, but why? What's happening? What's going on here? Where it's coming from? So I think that's, again, particularly for people that are making that transition, where they've been in a structure where they perhaps don't have to ask those questions so much because they have teams and they have progress processes and all the other things that go with being in a structured environment. Interesting. So what do you think are some of the kind of the direct benefits of being more self-empathic, if that's the right word, as a business owner?
Look, it's a great question. There's lots. Again, if we start sort of big on a contextual level, there's data and research out there now that shows that people that are stronger in self-empathy suffer less with things like depression and anxiety. So there tends to be a lower level of those sort of emotional health issues in people that do self-empathize more effectively. But from a business point of view, there's a couple of interesting things, actually, again, from a research point of view. People that are self-empathic, which is the right term, or empathetic, both work, are higher risk takers. And the psychology behind that's really interesting, because fundamentally, at an evolutionary level, we are wired to not create self-harm, right? We are wired to protect ourselves, because when you take away all the external influences and the stress and the 24/7 working and all the stuff you were just talking about, from an evolutionary point of view, we don't want that. We want to be well. We want to be healthy. We want to be strong, right? So people that are good at self-empathy tend to be higher risk takers, because they're not so hard on themselves about what happens if it doesn't work or what happens if it fails. We are less likely to lead ourselves into sorrow or fear because we're better at self-empathy. So we less often fall into that sort of self-pity, stuff. So business leaders that are good with self-empathy are higher risk takers. They've been shown to do higher levels of innovation for similar reasons. There's a less fear of failure. There's more sort of natural confidence in demonstrating those sort of skills, and they're also better with other people, because empathy is a skill that's it's a skill that we can learn. It's a skill that we can practice. So empathy or self-empathy, all types of empathy, sits in the prefrontal cortex, part of the brain. Something we're all born with, and it's a skill that you can practice. So just like, I don't know, riding a bike, the more you do it, the better you get, the more naturally you do it. It will be the same with all types of empathy. So when you're more self-empathetic to yourself, and that becomes a skill that you're better at, you will be better at empathizing with others. So business leaders who are honing the skill of empathy are likely to have stronger relationships, stronger teams, more camaraderie, better cohesion, ability to motivate, ability to influence. Fundamentally, if you're trying to sell something or influence someone in something, understanding them is key to that. So yeah, higher risk taking, higher levels of innovation, deeper or perhaps more effective relationships, which are all critical pieces, right? Especially if you're in a small or medium business, and you be all those things. You've got to be brave and innovative.
No, absolutely. So that kind of brings it back into your core work, because I think there's a large skew of your thinking and the stuff that certainly I've followed, which is empathy within the workplace, particularly at leadership level. Do you think, so just focusing on that for a minute, do you think it is a top-down mandate, or do you think it's something that needs to happen all across all levels of an organization?
Look, I think culture is built from the top, right? Yeah. So in any sort of organization there where you've got culture, because you've got enough people in there, it's not, maybe a sort of a one or two man or two person business. I think culture and leadership starts at the top, and people look up for guidance. So a lot of what I talk about is around leadership and how we as leaders should be showing that, because certainly in my experience, empathy is contagious. The more I empathize and understand my teams, the more they give it to me back. They empathize with me. And there's all kinds of benefits from that, not least of which is just happier, more cohesive teams, some of which you can see wandering in the background behind me. But having said that, one of the things that has been most motivating to me in recent months is my work with graduates and really young sort of Gen Zs, because they totally want a new world. They just don't get what we've been up to for years. They don't understand why we would put up with sort of workplace bullying and all of these things. So they're many years away from being leaders from an institutional level, but they are leading change in their circles socially, as in online and in the real world. And I'm really passionate about driving that conversation with them, because they are going to change tomorrow. They're going to be the ones that rebuild and change the direction of these organizations. So I think it's both top down and middle or bottom up. It's a social issue, something that we can all take responsibility for.
Sure. And bringing it back now to people who are transitioning into or in the early stages of being a business owner. What do you think? For me, my work really around resilience is unpack resilience through my particular coaching lens. It's around building very high levels of commitment, so very high levels of focus, determination, emotional engagement, what you're doing, then control. So having, particularly in terms of control around productivity, stability, how you're interpreting events that are happening outside of you, and the actions you're taking in response to that. And then finally, an appetite for competency, which doesn't suggest that you're incompetent. It's all about having the humility to it comes back to curiosity. You don't know what you don't know unless you have a curiosity for knowing that, and having an appetite for building those skills. So for me, empathy really falls into the control section. Is having the curiosity to understand when you're triggered, why you're triggered, and how to avoid that going forward. So going back to some of those things, I'm particularly interested around the risk-taking and innovation, which, as you said, are two things that are absolutely vital if you're going to, sort of get that momentum and success you want as a business owner. Do you think that's largely down to having a healthier relationship with the risk and tolerance with risk and failure? More of a tolerance with failure, and having more of an appetite for having that kind of growth challenger mindset rather than something that's fixed and staying within comfort zone?
Yeah, look, I think it's something I would love to study more deeply from a psychological point of view. Why? And I think there's loads of work to be done. It's not that I haven't studied it; it's that it's not really out there yet. It's is quite new.
Right.
My perspective on that comes back to that sort of quick point I made earlier around evolution and us as human beings, and that fundamentally we want to avoid sorrow. We naturally want to avoid feeling sad, feeling sorrow, feeling pain. One of the great things about empathy is when they've studied it in MRI machines, when they've studied the brain, when empathize the same, when the empathy light bulbs go off in the brain, the joy sensors of the brain are also lit up, as it were. So what we know about empathy, whether it's to others or to ourselves, is that it does provoke joy. The reason I'm saying that is if you put those pieces together, so naturally we want to avoid feeling bad, and actually when we empathize we feel good, what that results in, and this is data that is out there, is higher motivation levels. So I'm not sure about the psychology of sort of confidence or resilience towards failure. But what I do know from the research is that we naturally have a commitment to wanting more, to doing more, to be braver, to be more motivated, to perhaps face things more head on when we're using self-empathy. Because if the alternative, for example, to self-empathy is sort of attacking yourself or being overly negative or high criticism, those types of things, those are the things that create barriers, right? I shouldn't do that. I'm going to be no good at that. I won't be able to succeed in that. I might ruin it. I might fail. All of those emotions are the opposite. And that generally is what stops people from having a relationship with failure or fear or putting themselves out there. So, yeah, as I said, I think there's more research to be done, but certainly from a human point of view, as I said, we know self-empathy leads to high levels of motivation and just sort of energy to go out and try things. So that would really support us in that journey towards facing and having resilience around things like failure or new ventures.
Gosh, that in itself is a phenomenal insight, isn't it? And a reason to start building self-empathy into your daily routine. So what's interesting about this, there seems to be a bit of a paradox between something you said about it's human nature to avoid sorrow. I mean, obviously, when we start going into the rules of the mind and the amygdala and looking for failure, I think there's a link there, which is obviously another conversation. But so there's that paradox between it's in human nature to avoid sorrow, but in the same time, it's learning to be highly critical of ourselves and learning that failures and mistakes are bad is something that we learn from a very young age. So there seems to be a bit of a tension there that's quite interesting. Has anything ever come up in terms of your research around that?
Well, what I do know is, so what I have been looking at quite a lot the last year is the education system. Two dimensions. One underpins the other. One is, if you look at the education system generally, massive stereotype, because of course there are many outliers all around the world, but the sort of mass education system on the planet today, it was fueled or created by or created for the Industrial Revolution. So the education system was put into place to create people that could work in factories as really efficient workers, right? We were in there to be able to stick to deadlines, to work as a team, to work on a product line, to be efficient, to commit to repetition, all of those things, right? That's what we needed. We needed people to the world, right? There was never such a thing in that education system for these types of skills we're talking about, which is sort of empathy, cohesion, communication, innovation, teamwork. We didn't need those. And the general, again, rule is that education system hasn't been updated in most cases. So are we teaching our children about empathy? No, in the most cases. Are we teaching them other ways to view failure or sort of out the box thinking that isn't follow the path and you'll get to the destination? No. So that's the first point. And then the second point is that even in the institutions where we are doing a good job of that, we tend to stop when children become sort of teenagers or young adults, and then they leave the education system, they're out in the real wide world. There are people having these discussions that you and I are having today, and we don't educate our adults. So they go off into the world, they go into these organizations, they perhaps go into organizations where there isn't a very empathetic or humane culture that's sort of heroing people, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So Yes, so that's what I do know. I do know that we need more and different forms of education if we're going to change that.
Yeah. And I guess that puts a little bit of emphasis on the parental role as well, of parents taking an active role in teaching their children self-empathy and teaching them all of the things we're talking about today, like softening what it means, what mistakes and failures really are, and encourage them to have that kind of perspective on life and not being too hard on themselves, which is obviously very difficult to do if they're then going into school and being taught the exact opposite, right? Fantastic.
Yeah.
So why do you think, I think you answered a little bit of this before, but is there any other reasons that you believe as a species, I guess, we're not more naturally self-empathic, other than education and the fact that we don't nurture that as a skill or a tool or a way of thinking and seeing as we become adults?
I think we are, Christian. I think we are self-empathic. I think I have a little girl, she's 3. When I look at her and all of her friends and how they interact with each other and themselves, they are self-empathetic and they are empathetic to each other. I think as a race, as a society, that's a word, we lose it. I don't think on the whole, unless there are contextual, so environmental or psychological impacts on individuals, because we do know that some people are born with challenges or different ways that they learn and work that may impact that. I believe from everything I've read and learned that we are self-empathetic. We understand as human beings that understanding ourselves and then understanding our tribe, our people, is a benefit to both ourselves and our people. We know that. We do know that. It's just that we lose it. And society has created a very individualistic, very technologically driven, ironically, given we're connecting on a screen, world.
Yeah.
We see single households, in cities like New York, it's at 39% now. So we live alone. Yeah. We connect with screens, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can draw you into an instant world. We leave our villages and our tribes behind. So we lose some of that legacy. So yeah, I think that there's environmental, social reasons, but I still believe that at day one, when we're born, we have it.
Yeah. And it's fascinating listening to what you're saying, because I've never thought of it from that perspective, because I suppose you're right. I look at my daughter's 8 years old and look at her and her friends, and there is a natural sense of empathy between them. So other than obviously the work that you're doing and helping evolve leadership to be more empathy driven, do you have any other points of view or any of the ideas about how we can start bridging? Because you talk about the empathy gap, is that right?
Yeah, I do.
Is there any way that we can help bridge and build that divide other than just what's happening in the workplace?
Yeah, look, I think leadership takes many forms, right? Whether that it's corporate, it's political, it's social, it's community, even in the home. So you mentioned earlier parenting, and I don't think it's fair to give parents that responsibility alone, because I think as parents have enough sort of heavy responsibility on them as it is to bring up children today. But yeah, there's all kinds of ways that we can be driving empathy, and there are people out there trying to help in terms of imbuing skills like listening, connectivity skills, social skills that we can be using in our communities, in our streets, in our microcosms. For me, I do this work alongside my full-time job, and my motivation every day is that if I impact one person today, and maybe my person today is you, to think about empathy differently, I can sort of go to bed that night and get up and do it all again tomorrow. Yeah. Because we can all make a change. It can't only be organizational. My focus on organizational is because I have an organization, I've put these things to practice here, but also because we spend 5/7 of our time, most of us, in a job. So arguably the quickest way to make mass impact is to try and do it through organizations, because everyone has a few people at least around them in an organization that they can impact. So it is something that I hope we can create more scale at from an organizational point of view. But I think anyone that has any microcosm around them can help to drive understanding and connectivity by practicing some of this.
And going back to what they can practice, one of the things that I think is really critical, particularly when I transitioned out, because I had a similar career path to you, being in the creative industries, is this thing about listening. And I think that it's when you delve into actually what it is to really listen and how you can improve your listening, it was extraordinary, because you must think of it, it's quite a simple tool. You just sit and listen, but it's actually so much more than that. For me, I think that's probably the most important one out of everything, that as a starting point. Can you offer anyone, not suggesting that you can sort of give away any expert advice, but can you offer any kind of tips for people that might want to start thinking about how they can improve their listening, their ability to really hear people?
Yeah, for sure. And you just said it, right? That last few words, your ability to really hear people, that is the key to all empathy. It's like the backbone, right, of our work. Those of us that work in the space, that's what we're trying to drive, because being able to hear people, all of us can listen, as in anyone that doesn't have hearing problems can listen to sounds around them. But to hear what people are really saying, to understand empathy, to understand what they're saying, where they're coming from, is a different skill. So some of the ways I talk about, there's one tip I give, which I learned about a year ago, which is great, which is if you're one of those people that struggle to focus on perhaps listening in meetings or big rooms, that type of thing, you push your tongue against the tip of your teeth, like the back of your front teeth. It often clears your mind. And there's an amazing sort of science behind that, which is that when your brain is full of thoughts, so you're supposed to be listening, but you're actually thinking, what am I going to feed the dog? Got to go to the vet. Don't forget the supermarket, pick up my daughter, all that stuff, right? Your tongue is moving. Tiny moving, but it's moving because you're talking. You're talking to yourself. So push your tongue to the back of your teeth. By stopping your brain, you stop talking. It's not going to last forever, but it will sort of focus you in. So that's a really fun, small little tip. But yeah, eye contact, really, really important, both for the people you're listening to and for yourself, because it makes you focus. But eye contact, again, when you look at evolution, we are tuned to know that when people look us in the eye, they understand us. They look at us, they see us, they hear us, right? Yeah. Fundamental definitions of humanity, to be seen and to be heard. And that makes listening easier, because people will give you more information, because you're more engaged. Things like body language, I'm sure you've heard, 83% of communication is non-verbal. Yeah. So when you're listening, it doesn't just mean you're hearing them. Your body is facing towards them. Your shoulders are in, your arms are uncrossed. Because again, subconsciously as humans, when you cross your arms, if you cross your arms now, I wouldn't care less consciously. I wouldn't think, oh, Christian wasn't listening to me. But subconsciously, even on a screen, when you cross arms, you create distance. So there is less listening going on. So yeah, I think
his arms gently.
Yeah, those are some of the things that are good, good sort of things to think about when doing what we call active listening.
And is this something that you teach actively in your where you work now, and or is it more just that you write and you talk about when you're writing and on things like this podcasts and stuff and being interviewed?
Look, I teach my team all the time, because I built this into my culture. So I had the privilege of having an agency to run, so I could be responsible for putting this all to the test, which is what I've done for the last 2.5 years, which was when I took on a business that was broken. I had that privilege of saying, all right, we're going to fix it this way. We're going to fix it with humanity at the heart, with people at the heart, with empathy at the heart. I believe it's going to work, but hey, let's give it a go. And luckily it did. But yeah, I do teach it. I do teach it to them, especially body language. And I have a very cross-cultural team. So I have about 20 people, probably from, I don't know, maybe 15 countries. So things like body language are also cultural. Yeah, we teach it in our team for sure.
And in danger of pushing you on the spot slightly, to say that you teach things in your culture and you've transformed where you work now. How in what ways, just so people listening to can really get some hard proof around this working, how has the business improved and changed since you've been incorporated all of this?
If I was being really mean, I would say you can read my book and find out. But seeing as I'm not really I'm not really mean. No, I'm teasing you. In I guess immeasurable ways, it's been such a change. The business I took on was a failing business. So we weren't at zero. We were at we were at -0, right? We really needed to build from the bottom up, both financially, from a client's point of view, and from a team. You know, we had fantastic, wonderful human beings here, but perhaps not the right people that we needed to go on this journey of turnaround. We had no clients, we had no retained clients, we had no supplier relationships. So yeah, it was a very difficult time for the business at that time. Where we are now, 2.5 years on, obviously we're coming out of COVID, so it's been a slightly rockier 2020 than we sort of. But yeah, we're a really strong business. We're about 20 people here. We have clients like MetLife Insurance, BMW, Unilever, some of the Unilever ex-brands, Intel, Microsoft, Emirates. So yeah, you know, now we have a really good roster of MNC global businesses here in the Middle East. We have 20 people. We're making money. We're growing, and we're winning. You know, in a market where we had no reputation and no clients, we now have a 95% pitch conversion rate of new business. So we've got something right.
Wow. And how's the team? I mean, do you measure sort of the human response to that as well, in terms of, you know, happiness and motivation, inspiration, all those types of things?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the things I'm working on now is how could we maybe create, I hate this word, but I'm going to use it anyway, a framework for measuring those things. Because what I do know is what you measure manifests. So you have to measure things. And when we set out on this journey, one of the things I set out to do, and when I was interviewing and meeting with clients and meeting team members, I kept repeating was, I want to create the happiest agency in Dubai. I want us to be the happiest team. How can I help you be the happiest version of you? And yes, we as I said, I haven't worked out the framework yet of how you really systemize that measurement. But for sure, we have very low turnover. So that's one way you can measure these things. Very high loyalty. We do have global scoring that gets done on a global level for our organization, and ours are very high. Motivation is high. I know that how we've come through COVID as a cohesive unit has been strong, and obviously I have comparisons in the market to know how other organizations or teams might be doing. So I think we're happy, and I think one of the things that's really important in that is, and you sort of said, do you train it, is consistency of leading with that, but also measuring them on it. You know, making sure that people know this isn't acceptable in this business, and this is. And we talk about speaking the kind truth with our clients all the time, and they know it. You know, the whole team knows that's who we are. So yes, to the extent that you can measure those things, I think we've got some good signposts that humanity is the hero in this story.
Excellent. I love that. It's a great quote. I'm going to quote you on that if you don't mind. So just bringing it back to the focus of my attention and my work, if you don't mind for a second. So I typically work with people that are in one of three stages. They've got the calling, which means they're still working for a company, but the calling to do their own thing is too strong, and they've made the decision. They've crossed the chasm, if you want, the threshold. The second one is boarding. So they've either handed in their notice or they're serving their notice, and they're committed. And then the third group is they're airborne. They're actively in business, and they're exposed, and they're out there. I think for me, the role of self-empathy is essential across all three of those areas, but particularly I think in the first two, where once you've made that decision, it agitates a lot of our stuff. That self-esteem stuff comes up. We're vulnerable. We're going to be exposed, and it's a breeding ground for all those things that we have going on inside us. So talking to those people specifically, how can they build? And I know we've sort of crossed this, but perhaps not in this sort of listicle form, but a few tips that they can start to build self-empathy into their journey now. Somebody that's starting to hear that critical voice, or is being held back a little bit, or self-doubt's thrown up. What can they do right now? You know, 3 or 4 things to help your book Soften the Edges, isn't it? Soften those a little bit, and start to cultivate their own personal culture of curiosity and sort of self-support and self-awareness, because really, which is what this is all about, and self-growth.
Yeah, look, I think you mentioned again the curiosity. I think that's probably at the core of it. I think one of the great things about empathy, again, from a brain point of view, and because of the neuroplasticity of our brain, which means that the brain can mold and flex to whatever we give it, basically, is that the decision, if you're listening to us, the decision to hero self-empathy, to be more self-empathetic, is enough to be more self-empathetic, right? So if you come out of this talk today and say, I want to do that, I want to really think about how I can be more self-empathetic to myself, that as a signal to your brain, because it's something we evolved with, will activate it. And that decision is decision one, right? And the great thing about that decision is as soon as you've made it, it's action. Your brain will activate your empathy.
So set the intention, set a clear intention that I am going to be more self-empathic. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. That's the first one. The second one then comes back to the curiosity. So once you've made that decision, to continue to be curious about the decisions you're making, why you're making them, how you feel about them, and to really, keep that curiosity about yourself as a priority, because it can be easier to empathize with others actually than it can be to empathize with ourselves. And curiosity, inquiry, that questioning is important. And the third one, I really think it's, the world's greatest resource is time. I mentioned you have to make the time, I try, I don't always succeed, but I try to every week find some time when I'm not talking to other people or running my business or being a mum or doing any of those things to actually empathize with myself, to look at what am I doing this week? Why am I doing it? What do I want? How do I feel about that? If I'm feeling drained or tired, why and how can I fix it? But as I said, it's not always easy to fit it in. So I think that if you've got the luxury of being at the beginning of your journey, scheduling, as you said earlier, that in priority is really, really important.
Yeah, I mean, scheduling and putting it in your diary or your calendar. I mean, it sounds a bit, but I think it really has to start there, isn't it? It comes back to your point, is setting that intention. Without that, these things quickly, you don't have the consistency, because it's all about building momentum, isn't it? And sending those compliance messages back to the brain that I'm doing this and I'm going to be doing this for a sustained period of time. And ultimately, what we're all trying to get to is building it into a habit where it just becomes second nature. And it isn't something that you're trying to build. It's something that you just naturally do, and it becomes part of who you are and your personality. That's really the goal for this. Maybe listen, I'm so grateful for your time this afternoon. Just to finish off, do you want to tell us a bit more about you and your plans, and obviously your first book's coming out, which is tremendously exciting, how people can connect with you, how they can buy the book, anything else you just want to share just as a wrap up?
Yeah, well, I would love to. The one last thing I'd say on our conversation is that I think, like you just said, scheduling is the beginning and all of those things. I think having a coach, somebody like you, Christian, to help people do that is really, really important. So it's difficult. And you also have to work out how to do that. For some people, it might be writing, journaling of some sort. For some people, it's exercise. For others, for me, because I'm a talker, I like to say it out loud, even to myself. So I wanted to close on that, because I think it might help people to maybe have a conversation with you or someone else in their network to work those things out. I think it's difficult to do these things on your own. So I want to say that. But with me, as I said at the beginning, my book comes out on the 15th of September. It will be available on all the normal channels, Amazon and all the bookstores and all those things, depending on where you're listening. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm very active there. I take that platform really seriously. I love it. But also on Instagram. And my show, season 2 of the show starts on Tuesday the 14th. And I think it's Tuesday the 14th. I'll have to check. But it's definitely Tuesday in a week and a half's time. And it's live every week at 10 a.m. Gulf Standard Time. On my Facebook and my YouTube. But I pop all the stuff on my channel. So anyone interested can tune in. And the last bit is my podcast, which is called Secrets of the Gap. You mentioned earlier the empathy gap, and Secrets of the Gap is similar conversation to this, with really interesting people about empathy in the world, connectivity, humanity, but it's all under 20 minutes. So all of my content is really short, because I try to be very empathetic to the world and just make really sort of bite-sized pieces of this puzzle. So yes, I'm so pleased. Honestly, thank you for inviting me on and having such a fascinating conversation and being interested, because as I said, that's really what this is about, just having interesting conversations.
No, and thank you again. I think, like, to your point about leaving one person to think about self-empathy or empathy differently, then well, you've certainly achieved that. I mean, one of my things about the Agents of Calm conversations is slightly, it's for me to learn and to leave these things, slightly wiser with them when I started. And I think I certainly am on this one. So thank you very much indeed. Yeah, and look, best of luck with everything. I'm sure the book's going to be a fantastic success, and I'll sure to check in again on Tuesday mornings.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christian. Lovely to see you.
You too. Bye now. Bye-bye.
Bye.